Welcome back to Access Point. Joel, it's good to see you. I know not everyone can see you, but you're looking very trim. Looks like you cleaned up very nicely. So excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, my current headshot will not look the same because I went a bit feral and I had to clean that up. It's great. This is audio only. No, I have a face for radio.
That is not true, my good friend. That is not true at all. So ITDR, we had a nice conversation with Steve. What'd you think? What stood out to you?
I think it was a great conversation. I think, people really taking away this idea that, the security landscape has really changed and the role of identity has really changed. And, we have to get new responses to that, right? The old paradigm of the sort of core security teams and the identity team just doesn't work anymore. I think everybody kind of realizes that, but he did such a great job of really teasing that out and sort of explaining why that's falling apart. What about you?
Yeah, same. It's interesting. I've talked to a lot of different analysts, and this has been a topic probably I've spent some time on the last 2 or 3 years. And the first few months just getting into this is what is it? What are we talking about? And just trying to help myself, people on the team, all the people we talk to find at least Imprivata's perspective, I guess, on what this is, and bringing in some experts to talk about that, I thought was really helpful. And, I alluded to Steve. So it's Steve Shoaff. He's the CEO of a company called Verosint. And obviously, for those who don't know him, and Joel, you may want to share this. You have a background with him from your SecureLink days.
Yeah, I've known him for quite some time. Yeah, and it's really interesting. Like, I think ITDR and sort of what Steve is doing with Verosint, is one of those scenarios where we can really help ease the burden of cybersecurity, right? Like what you can do with data and AI and identity has fundamentally changed over the last 5 years. And so I think it's really great to see some folks doing really innovative things around making security better and easier at the same time.
Yeah, that idea you said earlier, bringing security to identity, and really ITDR is that bridge between sort of classic security and the identity folks, and bringing all that together in a real and meaningful way. So thought it was a great conversation. We hope everyone enjoys it. And, we say this every time. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms. You can find me and Joel on social. So look us up, send us a note. If you have a topic that's of interest, we'd love to hear from you. And we hope you enjoy the conversation. So thanks for listening. Hey everyone, it's Chip. Just a quick note, we have Steve from Verosint on in this podcast to talk about ITDR. You may have seen Imprivata recently acquired Verosint, Steve's company. Just wanted to let you know, when we recorded this podcast, it was actually before any of that activity had started. And so the timing may seem a little awkward, but wanted to give you that disclaimer so you didn't have any questions about why we were asking questions the way we were asking them. So hope you enjoyed the podcast. Thanks for listening. Well, welcome everybody. We've got Steve Shoaff here from Verosint. We're going to have I hope, a lively conversation about ITDR and where that fits in. So, Steve, just to kick it off, why don't you take a couple minutes and introduce yourself?
Yeah, no, appreciate you guys having me on. Excited to talk about our excitement with ITDR and the next generation of threats organizations are facing. So just, quick background on me. I've had the real privilege, and frankly, it's just kind of an honor to work with some of the most iconic tech companies out there. I kind of started in the identity security space back at Netscape Communications, a browser company back in the late 90s. And then from there went on to Sun Micro, who at the time was, critical in the explosion of the internet and internet facing delivered services. Had a brief stop in between at AOL. That was, I won't talk about that very much, but, it was the trailer park of the internet, I felt at the time when I got bought, but also a company that was just truly transformationally, right? You have to say, they made the internet accessible to people in ways that had never been done before. From there started my first company, which got acquired by Ping, where I was the chief product officer at Ping Identity, a great run there with a fantastic team at Ping. And then started Verosint, right? The identity threat detection and response company. So happy to be here talking to you guys.
It's awesome. We never crossed paths. I was at ForgeRock, and we definitely had our own directory and competed against Unbound, and then never crossed paths at Ping. But it's awesome to have you here, and what a background. Although, what did you call it? The trailer park of the internet? I don't know. That was a new one for me. So it
is AOL, right? Well, just a short story there. When AOL and Time Warner merged, right? So it was this, what the world thought was going to be this, oh my gosh, like the premier connection to the internet with the premier content creator, right? Time Warner, when they merged, they gave us all a welcome gift, right? Mm-hmm. And the welcome gift had, the Time Warner magazines, this, that, and the other, but it had 2 movies in the bag. It had Casablanca and The Matrix. Well, for those of you that remember, The Matrix was like the first mainstream DVD. It's like, oh my gosh, there's this new media format called DVD, right? And The Matrix is like the preeminent thing. That wasn't in the bag. I had a DVD of Casablanca, but a VHS tape, right, of The Matrix. And I was just like, doesn't that say it all, right?
Yeah, that's funny. That's awesome. All right. Well, let's jump into ITDR. So you said identity threat detection and response. And I know that this is a topic, I would actually say this is a topic that there's a lot of confusion about in general, because it's used in a lot of different spots. And I don't know that it's always super well defined. At least my experience is talking with different customers, different vendors, even the analysts. Sometimes analyst to analyst, it's slightly different. So why don't you give us your definition of sort of what is ITDR and what does that mean?
Yeah, so our definition of ITDR, right, and you're right, we'll go into some of the confusion in the marketplace, but it's really the real-time detection and mitigation of any attack that is account-based. Okay? So the nature of cyber attacks is morphing and changing over time. And the bad guys have now determined that the most cost-effective form of attack and where they're the most successful is when they actually target a human, and they target a human's authentication or login credentials. Because if they can compromise a human's account, whether we're talking about a workforce and then I could do data exfiltration, or a partner and I can get access to things I shouldn't do, or a customer facing, I could start to commit fraud on a platform. Those accounts are now the attack vector of choice. So ITDR is a tool which gives organizations the ability to, in real time, detect, has an account-based attack occurred, how bad was it, and how do I mitigate it in real time? You're right. There's a bunch of confusion out there, right? Some people, and I disagree with this take that, for instance, Gartner will say ITDR is not a technology stack, right? It's a discipline. Well, okay, right. Yes, there's a discipline, but there's technology that enables that discipline and a tool set. And so I think ITDR is an important platform. It also represents this kind of interesting collision between two what have traditionally been complementary but very different marketplaces. Cybersecurity, right, is a massive marketplace, and people have been investing in tools, antivirus, intrusion detection, EDR, XDR. They are following bad guys into now identity-based attacks. Well, then you got the identity security company, IAM, right, identity access management, IGA, identity governance, right, and PAM, privilege access management, that also consider themselves core to security. Right. And now they're like, okay, well, that's our swim lane, identity. Right. So everyone knows it's a problem. People are trying to position as to, what it actually means and why they should own it. So there's a lot of confusion. That's creating a bunch of confusion. I agree.
That's interesting. You talk about it. Is there anything that you feel like has happened over the last little while to like create the surge of this new discipline or this new sort of capability in the market? Because, a bunch of those markets that you referenced, IAM, PAM, hardcore security, all of those, they've been around a while. Like, why is ITDR like a new thing?
Yes, that's a great question. I think, people are following the adversaries. Adversaries are now targeting identities, so you're targeting accounts. And so that's where the attackers are going. And so people are now paying attention to that. The identity industry, this has created a great opportunity for them to really up their reputation, right, in the security space. So, just from my observation over the last, 30 odd years in the identity space, we always talk about ourselves and describe ourselves as security, right? Value prop. The reality, though, is that we're more enabling IT infrastructure done securely than actual cybersecurity, right? And ITDR has now given a legitimate conversation point and insertion point to say, well, hey, we belong at the capital S security, big boy table of security, because it's now fundamentally an identity problem. And that wasn't that way in the past. So that's created this unique opportunity and point in time for the identity people to move beyond and shed their, well, are you really just IT infrastructure, right? Or are you actually core to security?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so when we talk about those sort of core to security, I think of like all the different pieces of identity, like the signals that come in, the sort of informational signals, operational signals, risk signals, right? There's a lot of things that happen with identity. And so how do you piece that all out to like answer that question? Is this core security, or are we running into the scenario where it's like everything is core security, right? Like every activity is core security.
Yeah, that's going to be, philosophical beyond my mental ability, but let me do the best I can with that. And let me start with kind of a grammar grounding if we can here. So at least in the States, anyone that goes, to school, we learn the who, well, when, where, why, and how, right? The 5 W's, and the H. Without the who, none of those things have any context. So the who matters, right? And the who in identity is a subject. The subject matters. Okay? So of course identity is core, right? I believe identity is core to everything, right? In fact, a couple of decades ago, I got interviewed. Why, I have no idea, but I got interviewed for CFO magazine, right? And I made this bold prediction that has not yet come true, but I still believe, right? That there would be a day when Walmart, the mighty Walmart, would no longer report year over year same store sales, because Walmart would realize that the store is just a fulfillment channel, right? And what actually matters to them is how many customers are interacting with Walmart on Walmart properties, whether those properties are physical or digital, right? How many of them interact on a monthly basis? What was their average monthly spend? Is their average monthly spend going to go up? How do I drive that up, right? That could be introducing net new stores or more online things. A business value proposition that is, the same or core, right, to anything you are. I mean, even if you're a 7-Eleven in a gas station, I want more people coming more often, spending more money the next time. So identity's always been core to everything. People just really haven't thought about it that way, right? I believe everything is better with an identity-centric view or an identity core view.
So if I can play back just sort of what I think I heard in terms of identity and where that fits. So you've got the identity players that are out there that I think we all know. You've got the core security players that are out there that we're all familiar with. There's lots of them. And identity is that bridge now, which I agree with. I look at my career 20 years ago when I was at PwC, and they had what they called a core security practice and they had an identity practice. And I think that that's all sort of merged. And what you're really saying is, look, identity becomes the centric piece. And to bridge that gap, we can start using ITDR as sort of the core security pieces that sits on top of that identity to further bridge the gap between these two pieces and drive real security based on identity, for lack of a better way to put it. Not that that's not what we've been doing in the identity space for a while.
Completely agree. Yeah. And that's what differentiates, I believe, our approach from the traditional cybersecurity approach. Cybersecurity traditionally has approached it from a device, network, device, endpoint, right? When those are, the identity behind the devices, whether it's a human identity, a machine identity, an agentic AI identity, whatever it is, right? Those are, the most important things in my opinion.
And, obviously in Imprivata, we do a lot in healthcare. We do other stuff too. Talk a little bit about sort of industries and how you see nuances in this working across different industries. And, we care a lot about shared devices versus IoT versus, consumers, that sort of stuff. I'd be curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, identity. First of all, there are several identity types. As I said, you've got employee identity, partner identity, consumer identity, machine identity, now agentic or AI identity, device identity, all sorts of identity types. Within those types, you also have context matters. So, for example, right, we've all probably driven by the used car lot that says, low credit score, no problem, right? So even within the context of an identity, there are certain factors that matter more, right? The credit score I need to go buy a used car at some sketchy place is not the credit score I need to pull a mortgage, right? From like a tier one bank, right? So even within a common identity type, in this case, a customer identity, there are external factors or data points, kind of signals that matter to that. Identity is by definition just across the board, right? So rather than seeing a difference between verticals, right, I really see more of a distinct difference between identity types, right? So for example, in a workforce, I care a lot about credential-based attacks. Has somebody been in a credential attack or compromised their credentials? Am I now under a stuffing attack? Has that resulted in an successful account takeover? Right. From there, are they moving laterally, or am I under a privilege escalation type thing? Right. To give me access to systems that can cause real harm, whether it's ransomware, data exfil, or business continuity disruption, whatever that may be. In the consumer-facing identity, a different identity type, I still care about ATO and cred stuffing, but I also then move into things like fraud. Hey, am I signing up for the same thing 10 times to get past, promotion, right? Block, right? We see this a lot, by the way, in AI type companies, because the cost to deliver AI is like really expensive and real. So the whole notion of freemium is like, well, not free to the provider anymore. Very high cost of making it free, and so people blow past the limits by creating 50, 100, 1,000, different accounts, right? Even though it's one person, one entity behind that. So I see more of the difference, Chip, in, what type of identity than the vertical. Now, that said, verticals that are highly regulated, banking, healthcare, public sector things like educational, this and the other, stricter requirements and unique features required than tennis shoe trading platform,
Yep.
Type thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We've obviously done some work together. That's how we get you on the podcast, right? But I think part of what we see too is there's a difference between someone inside the four walls of a hospital trying to access something bedside with a patient, and what's the risk associated with sort of, for Imprivata, badge tap and some other second factor authentication versus maybe what we're seeing. Hey, that same clinician is logging in from their house because they're transcribing their notes for at the end of their shift, and they're doing that sort of as a nightly activity and what that looks like. And I think it fits in. It's the same thing you're talking about. It's just, from our perspective, there are certain verticals where some of those pieces inside four walls, outside four walls really does come into play, and fits into the overall paradigm.
And I think that's how it sort of works, right? Like, or at least as we look into the future, like that's how it works. Workflow aware sort of identity risk dynamic. Like, what's the context of work happening, and like, what are the signals or the things I need to take into account to make a decision on, is that risky or is that not risky? Go on.
No, sorry, I was just agreeing. Yeah.
Which I mean is useful. Like we've been spending a lot of this time talking about identity, but like, and like detecting this stuff, but like, how does detection really happen? So if we're talking about these sort of workflow aware sort of risk analysis or threat detection, like, what does the threat detection really look like?
Well, the threat detection, you took this a direction which I wasn't expecting. That's okay, right? But we're probably going to come back to kind of signaling. Remind me, I want to talk about the data use right here.
I think that's probably an important way to start. It's like, how do you even get to the detection piece?
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. So let's start there. Look, a long time ago, you guys remember Kirk Cameron and Kirk's, laws of identity, right? Fantastic guy, a legend in the identity industry. I proposed to him an additional law. Oh man, this was like at a European identity conference. I don't know, decades ago, right? And the new law that I proposed to him was the amount of data about an identity is growing exponentially, far faster than the number of identities. Okay. And the reason why I wanted to, kind of codify that in people's thinking was the identity industry has been making incredibly consequential decisions on a very limited data set that effectively hasn't changed since the very beginning. Username, password, cookie, or device recognized or not, right? IP recognized or not, new IP in some period of time. What we've learned over the last, 10, 15 years is the category of data available, which we call OSINT, open source intelligence data, provides, dozens, hundreds, or thousands of data points that if you could operationalize in real time, you can make far better security decisions than you historically been able to do, and kind of move beyond this legacy narrow view of data available for security decision into much broader and richer context. So how does that translate into threats? Well, the combination, right, of provisioned identity, right, and your default posture, your behavioral data, your observed third-party OSINT, right, signaling that I have about you that you can't hide because you're just on the internet. We all leave trails and breadcrumbs behind, and typically use one of a handful of IPs and ISPs and have circadian rhythms and hundreds and hundreds of different things, have now created the opportunity to detect threats, right? And the threats that Verosint categorizes are named threats. So these are recognized patterns: cred stuffing, ATL, MFA location mismatch, MFA fatigue attacks. Unnamed threats, this is something that is unusual activity that we've detected. And this is really where, kind of AI and ML come in, right? They could auto discover these unnamed threats. They don't fit a well understood pattern that you could quickly say, ooh, that's bad, or that needs further investigation. I want to stop that. And then, kind of benign or, what we just call observed behavior, right? We don't know if it's good or bad. You gotta tell us. It's just changed the game, right? This data has changed the game with the ability to do real-time threat detection, not only of named, well-known patterns that you would expect, the security professionals to tell us about, but also kind of unnamed, unique, bespoke attacks, that are relevant, right? But may only be relevant to a specific vertical or a specific customer inside that vertical, right? I'll give you an example. We've detected kind of fraud rings on peer-to-peer trading platforms where people are not actually like shipping new pairs of vintage Air Jordans. They're actually laundering money. Right, is I'm posting something for sale, and then I'm also 36 buyers that are bidding those up, and I bid it up to thousands of dollars, and what I ship is like a $5 crappy pair of whatevers, right? And I would wash money through the platform, right? That's kind of unique threat to those types of trading type things.
That's cool. So that's really interesting. So talk a little bit, I guess, Steve, give us some perspective too. In terms of when you say real time, what is that? That's always a loaded term, I guess. How does real time work? What does that really mean? And that may bleed a little bit into response to the, it's detect ITDR. It's the D and the R kind of working together, right? But what does it mean when you say real time? How do you see that implemented? What does that look like?
Yeah. Okay. Well, first let's get scientifically correct, and we should say near real time.
Yeah, that's right.
For the purists out there, right? Yeah. So look, the name of the game for detection and response companies has always been, narrowing that window from the time of detection to the time of response. Right. You want to shrink the time to detect, and then you want to shrink the time to respond. Right. When you look at things, because identity uniquely sits at the front door, It's the front door of an account creation. It's the front door of an account self-service. It's the front door of an account authentication. It's the front door of an account accessing a resource, right? Privilege, changes or escalation, you name it, right? The identity is at the front door. We see all those things happening as they happen. And that gives a very interesting insertion point into inspecting not only is what is the identity action that I need to allow, deny, or challenge on, right? But actually saying, if I committed that transaction, kind of looking ahead into the future, right? Had I said allow, would that have triggered a threat? If so, don't say allow, right? Identity is uniquely positioned to deliver that value prop, right? To say before I do the allow, right? What would the outcome of that be? Now, I'll confess that's outside of Verosint's native control. We have to have strong partners like, Imprivata and others to do that because, we're not the identity provider. We're not the IDP, right? We're not the ones actually making the allow deny decision. You all are, right? But in collaboration, when you have that detection and response built into your IDP or IAM platform, man, you could really do things, right? And then if you send that out to PAM or IGA, it's like, well, wait a minute. If I escalate that privilege, right, then this person would be able to go do X, Y, and Z, or I shouldn't escalate this privilege, because this person had their account compromised and we found their password on a dark web, 8 hours ago. Right. So I need to go back and maybe do a light or heavy identity proofing to make sure they are who they say they are. Right. Before I kind of, grant this escalation of privileges. So identity is a super unique insertion point and frankly allows it, security professionals to do things that they've never done before, which is really, really cool.
Yeah. How do you see the sort of emergence of new technologies like AI being able to shrink that window? Like, are they going to have a material impact? You think of, LLMs or data analytics technology. Is that going to move the dial and shrink that window between detection and response?
Yeah. So first it has to, right? Because it's dramatically changing the game in a negative way for the attackers, right? The attackers can spin up massive attacks done much more sophisticated. I'll give you an example, right? Credential stuffing attack. We had a customer that came under a credential stuffing attack, and they just spun up a rented botnet, right? And literally used 897,000 unique IPs from 192 different countries, spread over the course of a 4-day period. Some high traffic, high volume, others like barely a drip. Type thing, right? So AI is facilitating or enabling the bad guys to do things. So it has to be part of our defense, right? We're going to lose the arms race if it's not. Now, to answer your question specifically, go back to this notion of unnamed threats. The creativity of bad guys can never be underestimated. Never, right? The most creative people in the world. Right. AI allows you to recognize net new attack patterns or bad things that you've never seen before that traditionally took a data scientist, a long, long time looking at a lot of historic data to see if anything actually had happened. And, which is why the average dwell time for an attacker that compromises an account, right, is measured in months. Right, before we actually realize they're kind of in the door. So yes, we have seen that AI has dramatically reduced the time to detect, right, bad or risky things, and it's just been a game changer.
And do you see the agentic AI pieces helping with sort of the response? Any of those pieces in terms of automation? I'm curious where you see that going.
We do, right? Although I think that's a little bit more promise than reality right now. And let me explain why. And that's not a technical limitation. That's a human risk aversion. Okay. And let me go into a little bit of detail on that. So our observation at Verosint has been, even though we can, unleash Vera, which is what we call our agentic AI, we can unleash Vera to kind of do things automatically on behalf of our clients. Very few of them want to do that, right? And the reason they don't want to do that is, they don't want to automatically, prevent the CEO from logging in, right? Or they don't want to automatically have swung the pendulum too far and kind of create a bunch of customer angst. By the way, this is not a net new problem for security, right? It's always been this problem for security versus the business. And, I
like
say
how do you
versus,
manage the change, right?
That's right. Yeah. They're not in adversarial relationships, but let's be honest, they kind of are, right? Because it's like the business wants to facilitate, frictionless, low friction, great customer experience. Security wants to, especially really true security professionals, I'm going to make it as difficult as possible, right? To unlock that door, right? And so this is not a net new tension. It's always been there. The agentic AI stuff can change that game, but I think it's going to take a little while for people to trust it.
Yep. It's interesting, so replaying just a couple key things you said there. One, you work with an identity provider. So that really ultimately means you can do it when a user's authenticating. I think the other piece you were making, sort of talking about, I don't know if it was clear, but it's also a continuous review, right? So once we've gotten past that initial authentication, you still got to be looking at users and what they're doing. And then how you use these AI tools to find anomalies, find pieces that you need to go deal with. And then, there's the ability to use things like agentic AI to sort of respond, but that's probably a little bit ahead of where companies right now really are ultimately looking to go with this. And I guess what that sort of leads to me, a different question on is perspective on, I know we get a lot of questions about other tools that are out there, the SIM tools that exist out there, the SOAR tools that exist out there. How do you see this working in those type of ecosystems?
Yeah, so the default behavior for us is to, when we make a detection, to publish those out to the SIM tool that already exists, right? And this is an area where I would like to see some change in the industry, because the way it exists today is the SOC team or security team are the frontline team responsible for the detection and response to a security incident. They've got decades of experience doing that from an EDR or a device or a network perspective, but they really don't understand how to do that in identity land. Okay. And so then they'll reach out to the identity team after the fact to figure out what to go do. The identity team needs to join that SOC team, right, to handle these identity-based attacks. And so they need to be notified as well. So typically for us, we will notify the SIM platform because the security team wants to get notified. They'll do the initial triage. Is this an event or is this an incident, right? And then they'll use tools like Vera and others where they could safely handle it right then and right there, even though they're not identity experts. But the scope of responses have been predetermined and configured by the identity team. So I've now safely enabled my non-identity expert SOC team to handle identity incidents, right? Which is really, really cool. Now, I would like to see the identity team, go from more of a supportive role to an active. But I want them to be on the front line, right? And I think that would be great. But they're using technology like ours right now to bridge that gap, to safely enable the security team to handle these net new types of problems.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly useful advice of how do you make this successful and actionable? Like when you think about going and leveraging ITDR in your systems, is there anything else that you're seeing that, would really help folks that haven't embraced this sort of new discipline of ITDR sort of successfully go about implementing or thinking about, leveraging technology like this?
Yeah. So the first one is to realize that, if you leverage an ITDR, add ITDR to your security toolkit or your identity infrastructure, you don't have to go all the way to the magic box, of AI discovering and shutting down threats. It's not a loss of control. Okay. You could turn the thing on, right? In a passive mode. Right. In fact, we recommend people do this already, right? Many IDPs will let you replay 10, 30, 60, 90, infinite amount of history that you can ingest into our platform. And then you can see where you sit and where you stand today. You can then start to deploy these, real-time mitigations. We call those workflows, right? In kind of an audit mode, right? And use our tools to figure out, how many identities would be caught up in the net of this net new policy, right? That I want to deploy for authentication purposes. So advice number one is, on day one or day zero, you don't need to go all the way to full auto, right? And you probably shouldn't go to full auto, right? Learn, right? See where you actually sit, see what your actual posture is, quantify for the first time what your actual risk things are, right? And then start to smartly deploy policies to automate those risk or areas of vulnerability. So don't consider it like oh my gosh, if I deploy ITDR, it's going to be a loss of control, which could negatively impact a business. That's not true, right? So people need to kind of get over that. The second piece of advice is, look, if you believe that you're under an increased volume of identity attacks, and by the way, if you don't believe that, that's not a credible place to stand.
It's true. It's a different problem.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So you need to take an identity-centric approach to your security, right? You just need to, right? Because it's just a reality that identity is the new attack vector of choice.
I think the thing that I'd be interested in too is just one perspective, especially in some of the industries we're in around critical care, their critical infrastructure and, critical care, lots of cost pressures right now. And that fluctuates obviously across different verticals, but your perspective on ROI, return, how you make that case. If someone's out trying to buy your tool and make that case up to your CFO or your CEO, whatever it is, in terms of sort of justifying the cost, which is always tricky with some of these security products. So any thoughts you have on that, I'd be curious about.
Yeah, so ITDR is one of the cool tools out there where the ROI is a self-defensive ROI, right? Meaning that you could turn it on, right? Start looking at what your actual exposure is, right? And build a business case, right, for why you need to go do something. Because you could actually quantify and show the risk. It's like, man, we thought we were buttoned up, but look at all this net new risk that's in the system that we were unaware of. Right now, when people walk in, CISO budgets are as much allocated based on fear and fear of getting fired, right, as they are grounded in the reality of your security posture, right? ITDR, disambiguates what the reality of your security threat landscape looks like, right? And can be used as a tool to justify security budgets and security spends, right? It also becomes a real-time report card of, am I doing better today than I was previously? Because you can see the trends over time. The number of attacks are going to be going up, but are the number of successful attacks going down? Right, you could report that if you got great KPIs that you could go and defend. The ROI that our customers see is pretty. It makes me want to raise the price. To be honest with you, right? It's typically our typical customer gets a full payback on their license in the first 3 months, right? And they will see 5 to 8x ROI on an annual basis. And the majority of that comes from the reduction in staffing time to determine if this event was an incident and then how bad was that incident, right? The longer things go on and the more sophisticated they are, the more investigative legwork that you have to do and the more remedial work you have to do, right, across one or lots of accounts and go into clean up aisle on aisle 5 type thing, right? The second, area of ROI is a reduction in cyber insurance. Right. It's like, hey, because I'm upping my game and I've got this, I've got, demonstrable KPIs, I could go back and justify to my provider. It's like, look, we're pretty buttoned up here. Right. And then the third, of course, is, the hardest to quantify is the avoidance, right, of an attack. Right. Preemptive medicine is always hard to justify. Is it working? Is it not working? I don't know. It's preemptive. Right. So, yeah.
That's how I feel about my hair loss medication. It's great. No idea. It's all good. Well, Steve, I think this was an awesome conversation. Appreciate it. Anything closing, just final thoughts you want to share? You've shared a lot. So, but give you the floor for a couple minutes if there's anything you want to close out with.
No, look, I think, I'm very excited, not only to be here with you guys having this conversation, but to be, expanding what we do together, right? Verosint and Imprivata, right? When I look at industries that are most under attack, healthcare, right, is always up in that list, always up in that list, right? And it's an industry that, you just want to make the core value prop be, facilitating amazing patient care, right? And doing that, in a way that introduces the least amount of friction between the caregiver and, and the patient as possible, right? And so the opportunity to partner with with an Imprivata, to help deliver that mission to where, hey, we're going to handle security so you can focus on your patient, right? It is super rewarding, not only on a technical level, but a personal level, a moral level. I mean, it's just freaking awesome, right? And we're really excited about that. I also think it's indicative, by the way, of other underserved, unique verticals like manufacturing. Manufacturing is one that, also is, typically not great at this kind of stuff. Well, the reality is we don't want them to have to be great at that. Right? We should be great on their behalf, so that they can focus on what they want to focus on. So I'm thrilled, that you all invited me to have this conversation with you all. I'm even more excited, though, to work with you in the future on this stuff.
Yeah, it was incredibly enlightening, too. Especially that ITDR is going to be a magic bullet solving some of these problems, especially the problems that nobody else is really looking at solving.
Yep. It's awesome. So we appreciate it for sure. So looking forward to that, looking forward to partnering more and where this can all go. So with that, Joel, any closing thoughts on your side?
No, thank you for joining, Steve.
Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and follow Access Point on your favorite podcast platform. We also welcome your feedback. Please send us any thoughts, insights, or suggestions to accesspointpodcast@imprivata.com or find us on LinkedIn. Until next time, I'm Chip and he's Joel. This has been Access Point.